from the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University. Hello, I'm Tara Brabazon.
I'm Steve Redhead.
And this is a sad but quite an affirmative podcast. As regular podcast listeners know, the wonderful Mick Winter was our fantastic PhD student. I've known Mick for 10 years. I taught him at the University of Brighton for his Master of Arts Creative Media, and he's a dear friend of ours, and he passed. He died earlier this year. He died, though, with a completed first, second, third draft of a PhD. So as most of you know, we move through 10 iterations of drafts. Mick had just finished the third draft when he died. So Steve and I made a decision that we would move this doctorate to examination. And I wanted to record this podcast for examiners. So we've got examiners organised for Mick so that they have full transparency about the process that we went through to supervise the posthumous doctorate. So they actually know what we've done in terms of reflexivity and academic and research integrity, and that's important. But we also wanted to record this podcast for supervisors in the future who may also go through a similar process. The posthumous thesis is rare. Certainly I have never supervised one previously. I've never examined one. I administered a few of them at Murdoch University. And Steve, have you ever either supervised or examined a posthumous thesis?
No, in all the ones I've done over the years, I haven't.
Yep, so it is very rare, and it was very surprising for us. And so I wanted to record this podcast, yes, for the examiners, but also for other supervisors, so that they can understand something of the challenges involved in this. And I certainly misjudged the time and the emotional state that I would be in doing this work. And so I just want to sort of share this and then talk with Steve about methods and methodologies to make it easier for other supervisors. But I thought it would take about 200 hours to get this thesis to an examinable standard. It's probably taken me closer to 2,000 hours to do it. And the reason why it's taken that amount of time is not because of the, inverted commas, heavy lifting that I've done on that thesis. In fact, it's the exact opposite. I've held myself back, and every possible editing or drafting moment that I'd be going through, I questioned it in and of myself if it was the right thing to do. So I ended up treating it like restoring a painting. So I treated the supervision of Mick's great thesis, because obviously I can't talk with him about any change I would make. So I've made very few changes. What I have done is treated it like restoring a painting. So I've got a Rubens painting, and it's not my role to change the colours or alter the scene or change the character or, inverted commas, improve anything. My role, I believe, in terms of handling Mick's thesis, was to render it the best thesis that Mick could do from the work that he left us. So it is a very different editing process, and I've been very, very careful and very conservative in my editing. Normally I'm very robust with my students, and I put in some edits and we talk about it, we have a row and they change some or not, and we keep going on with the iterations. But in this case there was no iteration and there was no dialogue. So I needed to respect Mick's final words and simply dust off some of the colours and dust off, make sure that the frame was right of the painting, make sure that the glass was clean, and make sure that, all the impurities in that painting were removed. And that's sort of how I've treated the editing process. But it's certainly taken me much longer, but it's because I've had to be very conservative and hold myself back. Also, it has been very emotionally difficult. Particularly in the last week when I've been doing the final push on the thesis, I've found myself sort of randomly crying as I've been driving to work during this week, because I suppose it does feel like the end. He's been sort of living with us, still alive and living with us as we've been editing the thesis, and as we've reached this point where we're about to submit it, it's got quite difficult, I think, because it feels like an ending, and it's been a very odd imaginative conversation in my mind, because as I've been editing Mick's work, I've had him in my mind, in my head, like I'm having a conversation with him. So it's been taxing emotionally and certainly very intellectually challenging work. I'm glad we've done it, but I just wanted to log how difficult it was. So, Steve, what have you learnt through this supervision of a posthumous thesis? What surprised you? What have you learnt?
Well, I think first listeners should know that there was an enormous amount of work put into this thesis by Mick before he died. He was our student, PhD student at Charles Sturt University, where we jointly supervised him. And then when we moved to Flinders University in Adelaide in South Australia, he moved with us.
Yes.
So over this period, he had amassed, I would say, about 150,000 words on this thesis. And as you say, he then, while he was still alive, drafted, in other words, edited down from that 150,000 words several times.
That's right.
And that became the eventual manuscript, which we again have adapted by editing and drafting down. So that is unusual in many ways as well. I mean, not many PhD students could or do write 150,000 words. He was a professional writer.
Yeah.
And he was able to do that. 150,000 words of quality. And then what we've done is edited out the extraneous material. So I think that's an important part of this. And that convinced me that when he suddenly died, that it was worth, as you say, restoring like a painting, in order to produce the best possible thesis that Mick Winter wrote.
Yeah, so just to give listeners, and obviously our examiners as well, a sense of what's going on there. So Mick, the first draft he presented to us had 150,000 words. By the third draft that we went through, and was my starting point, if you like, he got it down to 101,000 words. The thesis that's being submitted is 94,000 words. So part of the elements of what we were doing in our restoring of the painting and the restoring of this great thesis is actually just paring it back a little bit further, removing the extraneous material even further. But as Steve said, and that's a really important point, Dale, that actually Mick had done the heavy lifting in those first three drafts. So I would have found it much more challenging to start with 150,000 words and try and do something with it. But the just over 101 enabled me to just carefully pare back the argument, perhaps remove some of the cul-de-sacs. I think I only ended up removing probably 2 whole subsections in different chapters, small subsections, but removing those to just ensure the streamlining of the argument.
But so, I think methodologically,
if
we're talking to potential supervisors of people in this horrible circumstance, you wouldn't often get someone who wrote 150,000 words of a draft PhD thesis and then edited it down and then died.
I know, it's stunning. And that's probably the other thing too. Is there a methodology? Because every one of these cases is going to be radically different.
Yes, of course.
And what I would say to people is we all want to do the right thing by our students, and I really understand that, and obviously we've done exactly that. But what I would say to prospective supervisors in this situation is you really do have to have the draft, and the draft has to be complete before you would start this, because I think it starts to get a bit messy presenting this work to examiners if even a part of the work was incomplete. If the supervisor is having to write a chapter or write a linkage between ideas or subjects because the thesis was incomplete, I think that is probably a bridge too far.
Yes, I think that's a completely different circumstance.
Yes, whereas this was complete and we were simply shining it up, basically, ensuring that it's presented at its most resonant, really. So what did surprise you though, Steve? We're both very experienced supervisors and examiners, but what surprised you through this process of working with Mick in this way?
I think the most surprising thing was his sudden death. He'd been, as we learnt afterwards, ill leukemia for really quite some time. And what surprised me was how remarkable his work was given those circumstances. So it wasn't just an issue to do with someone who'd suddenly died. It was an issue to do with work produced by someone who had been ill. And it was illness which he overcame. He wasn't able to overcome death, but he was able to overcome illness to produce, as I say, 150,000 words first draft.
And be a great student and a dear friend, and we every week Mrs.
Absolutely, and it's unnerving because, as you say, because you're working with it, it almost keeps his memory alive.
Yeah, and that's why I think it's taken me so long, because I didn't want to let him down. I think that was the other problem too, that we just want to make sure his memory went out the best we could make it to, but it always had to be his work. I think where I was held back is I really wanted to make sure that it was his work. Every sentence was his work, not tempered or drafted or edited or added by me. I really wanted to make sure that all I was doing was shining up his work. Yes. I'm not even letting a professional editor in. I originally thought at the start we might have a professional editor come in and do the final gloss. And you know what? I'm even stopping that. I'm prepared for the examiners to see this and know that it is his work with full research integrity.
Yes,
you know,
me too.
And that was important. But I agree with you. The surprise and the power that a man who had been ill for a long time, and of course he didn't tell us, as a lot of people know. No. And that's fantastic. It's his right to do that, to share that information with his family. And we were just his mates. We were his supervisors, and we were his mates. And our job was to supervise him, and it was a pleasure and a privilege to always supervise. So the next question is, in terms of the supervision and the examination of a posthumous thesis, and this has been an issue we've talked about for months, is how does examination and the relationship between the supervisors and the examiners change in this type of context? And we're obviously thinking about it as supervisors, but also as if we were putting ourselves in the position of the examiners, which we've been doing a lot. What's going on there? How do you examine this?
Well, I think you have to provide examiners with transparency about the circumstances. Yes. I think that's actually all that supervisors can do. And then you have to leave it up to the examiners with that transparency, with full transparency about what had occurred and the timeline and so on. And also you were able to secure the support of the DVCR at Flinders, who was able to approve the process. I think all of that is very important, that a bureaucratic process is in place for such circumstances, and high-level university administration is able to approve and support that. But in the end, I think as supervisors, all you can do is what you would actually normally do, which is produce the best possible circumstances for the student to submit. And even after death, this is what's happened.
Yeah, so just to clarify, again, processes and procedures for people that come after us. After Mick's death, I wrote to my boss, and he is my direct line manager, the DVCR, Rob Saint, and I would have done this as the dean for somebody else's student as well. It just happened that it was my student.
Yeah,
and I presented in full transparency the case, the situation. Obviously Mick was an international student as well, so the international office was involved in all of this, and present to the DVCR the circumstances and ask him if he would be prepared for us going forward, noting we had a full draft. And he was incredibly supportive. All our colleagues throughout the university were incredibly supportive, and obviously the key was to keep Mick's wonderful wife, Catherine, involved in this process.
Absolutely, yeah, very much so.
And obviously we're about to say to her that we were about to submit this PhD. Also, in terms of the selection of examiners, and this might be useful for colleagues, I intentionally chose, with agreement from Steve, 2 very senior colleagues working in screen studies, in screen environment with a popular cultural inflection, but I intentionally chose 2 professors. And obviously I won't mention their name because they don't know each other, and the nature of the Australian process is it remains completely confidential.
Oh, absolutely right.
The examiners never know the other's identity, if that makes sense, unlike in England. And of course that's the other interesting thing. If this thesis had been submitted in England, obviously Mick couldn't have done an oral exam, so it couldn't have happened.
No.
So in the Australian system, ironically, this is the weird turn of the dice, that actually the thesis can be assessed by two very experienced international scholars, and they can use their best judgment about how they handle this. I suppose that the weird feeling for me, Steve, in this is normally, I'm very, very confident and very, this is what's happening and this is what's going to occur, and I'm very, very hands-on in the examination of our PhD students. In this one, I'm feeling much more delicate, I think.
But I think that's the circumstances.
Yes.
And having to return to something which was actually foreclosed by Mick's passing.
Yes.
So at first it seemed unreal, and now I
Yes.
think it makes it much more real. But I do think for people who've got to ever deal with this sort of circumstances in the future, the interesting thing is that issue of an oral exam, because obviously if someone has died, then you can't have the oral exam. But quite often, and I have had this circumstance, people can be quite seriously ill before an oral exam, and that very often still goes ahead, but with protocols that are put in place and so on. The Australian system without an oral exam, as you say, actually for once does make this easier.
Yeah, that's right. And what I would do in terms of transparency, just to finish this podcast, Steve, is I've actually put a statement on our behalf that we've both signed.
Yes, I think that's very important.
That we've had to countersign all Mick's declarations about academic integrity to check that.
Very, very important.
I'm putting
legally,
it through,
I think.
yes, I'm putting it through Turnitin on Monday, so I'm doing the full academic protocol checking on that. But also I've put in a supervisory declaration, straight after Mick's declaration, page 4 of the thesis, where I've actually stated this is what has occurred.
Yes, I think that's very important.
And this is how we have done this, and this is what you are assessing.
Yes.
And can I say, just in terms of the oral exam, of course, I've also listed for the examiners all the podcasts that we've done with Mick, of which there are 35.
I was going to say on a fortnightly or even weekly basis at one time, as we do with all our PhD students, we did podcasts on the meetings, which became very important as far as he was concerned in terms of note-taking.
Yes.
They were note-taking, but they were also a very credible example of the discussions of his development of this excellent 150,000 words, and even discussion of the editing down from 150, which we still talked about at the end.
In the last podcast, because of course we were doing it right to the end. And literally, we had a meeting on Thursday, and he died on the Saturday.
Yeah.
So
and we'd been discussing cutting out even more
yes.
of that manuscript.
Yeah. So in terms of research integrity, and I wish we'd planned this, wonderful podcast listeners, in terms of research integrity, examiners can hear the development of his ideas over 2 years, 10 months. And so there's no doubt it's his work. They can hear the development of the work. And indeed, this podcast is meant to demonstrate methodologically how we have handled this, and hopefully provide tips for punters if you're ever in that difficult situation. Obviously, contact Steve and I if this has happened to you in any university around the world and you've accidentally found this podcast when you've searched posthumous PhDs. Please feel free to contact Steve and I, and we can talk through this, because
it's one of the unintended consequences of podcasting.
It certainly is.
That it's a record which can be submitted as part of the thesis to the examiners.
And it is just absolutely astounding. So I didn't know that, obviously, because Mick, of course, is a professional communicator. He was involved in radio, professional writer, and so his podcast, had a huge following too. Can I say
tens of thousands
of people followed him all the way through because he was so charismatic, and it's such a great thesis too. So, and it has been. I suppose I've had to deal with every sentence and every word, and it's meant sometimes I've forgotten how incredibly fantastic and innovative and interdisciplinary. I mean,
absolutely,
it's amazing, and it's this fantastically, weirdly wonderful thesis dealing with memes and morphic fields and mapping morphic fields against Althusser and against Bourdieu, and it's and against Zizek, and it's powerful, edgy, out there research.
But the podcasts show the development of it, as you say, over years
Yeah.
as we supervised. And there is no other record of that.
No.
You don't see the development in the thesis.
No, that's exactly
You see a
right.
finished version.
That's exactly right. So we've got this fantastic situation where we've been fully transparent to the examiners. This is, I think, hand on heart for me, Mick's work that I've simply dusted down. I've dusted it down, I've framed it, I've cleaned up the glass at the front, so it is presenting his work that he left to us the best it can be.
We've restored his painting.
We've restored his painting, and I, with full ethics and hand on heart, can now present this to the examiners and wish them well in their examinations and determinations.
Absolutely, and that's all you can do in these circumstances.
Lovely. So, Steve, thank you again for the work you're doing. You're doing, as most of you know, Steve does the final examiner's read on our PhD students. So just before we submit, he does the examiner's read to make sure it is of standard, and he would do this if the student was alive or dead.
Yeah, it's the same.
And what Steve is doing is, in some ways, I suppose, checking my work as well, just making sure everything's holding together, everything's fine, and we've given Mick the best chance to move through the examination process. So, Mickster, we did it for you, bro, and we'll be submitting, I think, next Tuesday, all being well. So, Steve, thank you for this, and we will do one final podcast reporting back on how it went too. I think that's important for podcast listeners to hear how the examination went, and we'll talk through those reports, and we might even try and organise for Catherine to have a podcast with us to summon this work and summon her great husband and our great student. So, Steve, thank you.
Thank you.
For more information about the Office of Graduate Research at Flinders University, please refer to www.flinders.edu.au/graduate-research.